tuve la fortuna de ser co-chair de LASA con la presidencia de Max Cameron y mis colegas Natalia y Juan Luna. Y este es uno de los paneles presidenciales. Nuestra intención fue pensar una de las palabras que forman el título de este congreso, que es revolución. Una palabra de grandes resonancias y posibilidades aún en esta época. Entonces la idea es tener un panel en dos partes. Nos encantaría que todos se queden a la segunda sesión porque está pensada de esa manera. Queremos abordar la historia de las revoluciones en América Latina, en retrospect, pero también pensar sus posibilidades actuales. ¿Qué relación hay entre las revoluciones del siglo XIX y XX y los movimientos sociales actuales? Estoy muy agradecida con mis colegas que han aceptado esta invitación. El chair de esta sesión es Alan Knight de la Universidad de Oxford, quien va a presentar a el resto de los panelistas en orden. Pero estoy muy agradecida porque la historia y la sociología se juntan en este día y con todos ustedes será muy agradable. Muchas gracias.
Well, good morning. I'm both giving the first paper and chairing, so I'm going to very quickly introduce the three ponentes and the comentarista, and then I'll straight away start, and each speaker will get 15 minutes, so that should leave a good half an hour for the public to ask questions or take part. So I'm Alan Knight, Emeritus Professor at Oxford University. The second speaker will be Christina Heatherton of Trinity College. Thirdly, Professor Manuel Castells, the University of Southern California, and the comentarista is Tanalis Padilla from MIT. So without more ado, I'm going to start with my 15 minutes worth. Well, I'm asked to talk about Latin American revolutions, a big subject, which I'm going to make even bigger by referring to some other revolutions. After all, Eurocentric historians of revolutions, as Chust observes, habitually neglect Latin America, but there's no reason for us to follow their bad ethnocentric example. Now, for brevity, I adopt a bullet point approach, a preamble, and then 6 points. First, categories, causes, process, violence, plots and actors, and at the end, the end. So first, I come to analyze revolutions, not to praise them. Revolutions are interesting and important, rewarding to study, risky and unpleasant to live through, assuming you survive. It is not our job as historians to lavish praise or cast blame, that being a job for moralists or preachers. I mention this because some radical accounts are a bit starry-eyed, while some conservative critiques come laden with moral condemnation. Both approaches, and both incidentally exaggerate Latin America's revolutionary record, are rather misguided. Our job is to say what happened, why, and with what results. First, categories. Revolution belongs to Eckstein's category of internal war. Revolts, coups, civil wars, diverse phenomena which carry both social and ideological labels: nationalist, liberal, socialist, Jacobin, Eastern, Western, from above, from below, peasant, proletarian, and of course that old can of worms, bourgeois. And of course, failed versus successful. Of course, revolutions typically combine several categories, especially when ideological labels like liberal or socialist are conjugated with social categories like bourgeois or peasant. So-called internal war comes in many sizes, from small rebellions up to great revolutions. And size, I think, embodies two dimensions which should not be conflated: radicalism, the notional threat posed to the status quo, and scope, impact across society. An explicitly radical challenge, like Mexico's Magonista revolts of 1906-8, may briefly affect a few localities, while a moderate but widespread popular movement like Maderismo, 3 years later, can achieve decisive national impact, the fall of the Diaz regime, a clear-cut political revolution. Thus, a swathe of moderate or traditional revolts can have radical consequences, even if their ideology seems, in retrospect, rather tame and pedestrian. We can again cite Maderismo, even its tenuous ally Zapatismo, or go back to independence, seen by Eric Van Young as narrow, localistic, prescriptive, traditional, yet which undermined and finally toppled the colonial regime. Second, it's useful to divide the causes of revolution into structural and conjunctural. This is common practice. The first, long-term and deeply rooted, social, political, economic, or as Goldstone stresses, demographic. The second, short-term and stochastic, transient, crises, role of leaders, contingent accidents. On the one hand, Eliot's vast impersonal forces, on the other, Brodel's L'Histoire événementielle. The first are inexorable and impersonal. Though beyond individual control, their impact can be either aggravated or assuaged by individual conjunctural decisions. The structural causes of the Mexican Revolution, peasant dispossession, authoritarian social control, were repeated elsewhere in Peru, Bolivia, Guatemala, though not Argentina or Uruguay, but they were less concentrated and less acute. Also, the Diaz regime, being personalist and sclerotic, failed to mediate and indeed exacerbated those tensions. The Andean region witnessed plenty of peasant revolts, but they didn't gel into a social revolution, or what Wolff called a peasant war. Diaz, with his mismanaged criminal interview, ostracism of Reyes, promotion of insouciant Porfirian juniors like Pablo Escandon, aggravated rather than assuaged socio-political tensions. Of course, personalist authoritarian regimes, from Charles I to Ceausescu, tend to behave like this because they lack constraints and are cocooned in comforting webs of yes men and sycophants. D. Trump, please take note. The Latin American wars of independence are again pertinent. The old notion of purposive patriotic revolutions ousting an oppressive colonial regime, a notion which was often crudely nationalistic and politically self-serving, has given way to a revisionist consensus which stresses that these were civil wars, not maybe revolutions, that the wars were caused not by internal tensions, but the French invasion of Spain, that absent the invasion, the empire would have happily survived, perhaps, according to one fanciful counterfactual, mutating into a happy Hispanic commonwealth. And finally, that patriotism played little part, since the new republics lacked national sentiments, which only appeared much later. In short, the French invasion was not just the trigger, it was the cause of independence. The argument hinges on the distinction between structural and conjunctural causes. Contra revisionism, I would see the French invasion as a conjunctural event, a trigger perhaps, which determined the timing of what happened, but which, absent deeper structural factors, would not have destroyed the empire. Compare what happened a century earlier when Spain was plunged into civil war, but there was no colonial breakaway. Those deeper causes include fiscal pressure, ethnic discrimination, administrative reform, militarization, anti-clericalism, which provoked serious social protest. And while a clear-cut nationalist blueprint was absent, as it had been in the US, by the way, there was no explicit proto-patriotic stirrings allied to powerful anti-Gatupine sentiments. Also, to expect revolutions to be preceded by clear-cut statements of intent by participants, many in this case illiterate, and all living under a repressive regime, is historically naive. Revolutions typically confront such regimes and don't follow meticulous pre-announced plans. They evolve rapidly and chaotically, and actions on the ground count for much more than proclamations before the event. Independence suggests a second pattern of revolutionary causation, subversive pressures from below, permissive factors from above, which correspond roughly again to structural versus conjunctural. Independence was triggered by an external crisis which enabled internal structural grievances to surface. The old model of the pressure cooker helps. The grievances are the simmering stew contained by a screwed down lid. But if the lid cracks, as it did in 1808, the stew explodes. Skocpol's model of social revolution follows this logic. Crises following financial collapse or foreign war weaken regimes, i.e. lids, which succumb to revolution, the exploding stew. The key variable is the crisis. As I said, the contrast between 1808, crisis and revolution, and 1700, crisis and quiescence, calls into question this top-down explanation. The lid is no doubt important, but plenty of states experience sporadic crises or foreign wars that don't provoke revolution. Conversely, revolutions happen which defy this top-down causality. The Mexican, Cuban, and Nicaraguan revolutions were not products of war or financial crisis. Nevertheless, seduced by Huntington, Skocpol, or others, analysts have tried to contort the Mexican Revolution to fit this model, exaggerating external pressures or bizarrely claiming that the collapse of the center, the government, preceded popular revolution rather than the vice versa. But that is putting the cart before the burro. Guerrilla war preceded the fall of Diaz, causing the collapse of the center. Of course, governments can fall for reasons other than popular revolt. A state can collapse. Very occasionally, a social revolution can occur in the absence of war and social upheaval. For example, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1989. That outcome was revolutionary, but the preceding process was not. Such phenomena, very rare in history, are better labeled implosions than revolutions. Next, two related points, process and violence. The distinction between process, socio-political conflict, and outcome, the establishment perhaps of a new revolutionary regime, is not watertight. Agrarian reform can occur unofficially during decentralized revolutionary upheaval and later officially when the new regime takes power, a sequence evident in Mexico, China, and Cuba. The revolutionary process also creates its own dynamic, which goes beyond plans and manifestos, but leaves a durable legacy. In Mexico, greater spatial and social mobility, hyperinflation, dearth, disease, population loss, widespread violence, and popular empowerment. Something similar followed the wars of independence. But we should note that the radicalism of the outcome doesn't correlate with the scale of the upheaval, the protest, mobilization, and violence. The Cuban Revolution was briefer and less bloody than the Mexican, but it heralded a more radical revolutionary transformation, including of the basic mode of production, something which had not occurred in the US, France, or Mexico, though it had occurred in Haiti. Regarding violence, is it diagnostic of revolution or can there be bloodless revolutions? Experts diverge. But I repeat, velvet revolutions, rapid peaceful transformations are very rare and are perhaps better termed implosions, transformations induced by the collapse of a bankrupt regime. Latin American transitions from military to democratic regimes perhaps belong to a similar category. They didn't typically involve widespread popular insurgency or bottom-up violence. Of course, top-down violence had happened at the hands of the regime. Occasionally, peaceful elections can herald radical change, perhaps Argentina in 1946, Chile in 1970. But the electoral road to socialism is a narrow path rarely trodden. The causal link between violence and revolutionary outcome isn't random. Revolutions involve big states, vested interests dig in and defend privilege, and overturning old regimes is, to quote Mao, is not, in Mao's words, a dinner party or doing embroidery. The correlation between the violence of the process and the radicalism of the outcome is variable, but the link between revolution and violence seems recurrent and perhaps inevitable. Of course, plenty of political violence has nothing to do with revolution. Assassinations, military repression, paramilitary violence are not revolutionary. More important, because the confusion is common, revolutions and civil wars are different. Both involve violence, and clearly all revolutions, leaving aside the rare velvet variety, all revolutions are also civil wars, whether prolonged conventional campaigns, as in Mexico, or short, sharp insurrections, as in Bolivia. But not all civil wars are revolutions. Many civil wars involving rival dynasties, regions, or factions carry no threat of revolutionary transformation, that is, a substantial shift in class, ethnic, or political power. When revisionists refer to the wars of independence as civil wars, they are stating the obvious. However, they seem to often to imply that they were not revolutionary. They did not involve substantial socio-political stakes. Yeah, that was precisely, I think, why people took up arms, risked and often lost their lives in pursuit of rival objectives, a process which, incidentally, cannot be adequately explained by rational actor models. Penultimately, plots and actors. Theorists of revolution posit distinct stages of revolution. For example, Brinton's model, involving an initial moderate phase followed by a radical lurch to the left, ending in the Thermidorian reaction. Brinton's model was based on the French sequence, just as Francois Javier built his later questionable interpretation of the Mexican Revolution on shaky French foundations. And Brinton extended it to England and Russia. Russia, of course, became the second big meta-example in mainstream revolutionary studies. Stage theory of a more abstract kind surfaced in James Davies' old notion of the J-curve and quite a few other analyses. Revolution certainly passed through phases, and periodization is a legitimate concern of historians. But the notion that revolutions follow, invariably or typically, a common pattern is mechanistic and mistaken. The Mexican, Bolivian, and Cuban revolutions all follow different trajectories, not to mention the English, French, Russian, and Chinese. There is, however, I think, one plausible rule of thumb. It's not a kind of Tolstoyan law. Moderate liberalism, evident at the outset, soon withers in the heat of revolutionary conflict. Hence, revolutions rarely give rise to liberal democratic regimes. The big exception open to debate would be England's glorious revolution, so-called, of 1688. But the French Feuillants, European liberals of 1848, Madera in Mexico, Kerensky in Russia, Sun Yat-sen in China, the liberals of the late Ottoman Empire, or their Cuban counterparts a generation later, all face defeat and disillusionment. So if it's not a law, this seems a recurrent tendency, and it can be plausibly explained. Functioning liberal democracy takes time to root, as the rules of the game, alternancia, are established and players learn to accept them. Here, game theory may help historical analysis. But revolutions, being fast-moving, disruptive, and violent, are inimical to such evolutionary processes. They're often associated with foreign interventions, give examples, and a liberal democracy tends to depend on the rule of law to consolidate. Revolutions are also high-stake conflicts involving rival groups, social, ethnic, ideological, against each other. They're often zero-sum games involving powerful allegiances and irreconcilable differences, wars to the death, scarcely amenable to the peaceful horse trading of liberal democracy. The latter follows Lockean principles, but revolutions resemble Hobbes's war of all against all. So revolutions don't, I think, display patterned regularities in terms of plot, but there is a loose logic to class participation. Class, of course, may not be the sole determinant of revolutionary participation. There are other important factors. The great revolutions occurred in agrarian societies, and as the classic studies of Woolf and Moore emphasize, peasants played a key role. Industrial societies have rarely generated social revolutions. Regarding causality, peasants in so-called modernizing societies faced sustained threats in what was a harsh zero-sum game. Industrial class relations, though conflictual, can allow some sharing of a bigger pie. Those threats go beyond the economic to assume a moral dimension, what Moore called moral outrage and James Scott analyzed in terms of the moral economy of peasant protest. Such approaches explain revolutionary commitment more convincingly than rational actor models. Finally, peasants are better placed to mobilize and resist with guns or machetes in hand than urban workers or middle classes who are concentrated in the cities under the watchful eye of the state. Hence Huntington's so-called, though misnamed, Eastern model, rural guerrilla warfare culminating in a revolutionary seizure of the cities, a sequence evident in China, Mexico, and Cuba, though not actually in France, Turkey, or Bolivia. Finally, we come to the end. The feature of revolutions, which both Hobsbawm and Meyer and others observe, gets much less attention than the question of how they start. Some end in violent counter-revolutions, Central Europe, 1848, Guatemala in 54. In each case, the golpistas sought, with success, to turn the clock back. Of course, some counter-revolutions fail and may indeed accelerate the revolutionary process. Huerta in Mexico, Wan Shikai in China, Kornilov in Russia, and foreign interventions can also have counterproductive outcomes. The Austro-Prussian invasion of France, the Bay of Pigs in 1961. These cases reflect pretty clear binary alternatives, but some counter-revolutions are discriminating and partial. In France, Thermidor ended Jacobin rule, while Napoleon overthrew the Republic, but without wholly subverting the gains of the revolution. The Bolivian coup of 64 ousted the MNR, but did not dogmatically turn the clock back. The agrarian reform survived, the mines remained nationalized. Clearly, this was a different revolutionary demise compared to the abrupt counter-revolution which ousted Arbenz a decade before. Lastly, undoubtedly the most important case, not just in Latin America, but the entire world, there is the Mexican Revolution. Like the Russian, that's a joke, by the way. Good to get a laugh. Like the Russian and Chinese revolutions, the Mexican never suffered a serious reversal, either immediate or belated. Rather, having accomplished a series of major reforms through the 20s and 30s, the regime mutated as political generations came and went, the global context and domestic class structure changed. There was no sudden counter-revolutionary watershed, but rather a prolonged piecemeal thermidor, consummated in the regime of the PRI, its eventual neoliberal turn, and its final fall from power. By then, the revolution had become an item of rote incantation, an official mythology epitomized by the oxymoronic label of the PRI. And Morena's recycling of that mythology seems to me mostly window dressing. This process, the routinization of revolution, was foreseen by Franz Kafka, who, when asked about the course of the Russian Revolution in the early 20s, gloomily replied, quote, here I'm going to end, as the flood spreads, the water becomes shallower and dirtier. The revolution evaporates and leaves behind only the slime of a new bureaucracy. A sobering conclusion, which, to go back to my starting point, serves as a warning against being too hopeful and enthusiastic about revolutions. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I'm exceedingly grateful to Adela for inviting me to join this very esteemed panel. I'd say in many ways, Tanalis Padilla, today's discussant, has set the stage for today's conversation in her contribution to the LASA Forum. Writing from Cuba amidst the extrajudicial US assassinations throughout the Caribbean, the abduction of Nicolas Maduro, the ongoing ICE terror against undocumented people, those, quote, scapegoated for the domestic damage wrought by a crumbling empire. She asks how revolution of the past might revive an internationalist consciousness necessary to confront the present. And I think this is the central question. As we speak here in Paris on the 155th anniversary of the crushing of the Paris Commune, we're 5 miles away, amidst ongoing genocide, endless wars, and future capitalist planning, which seems to exclude most of humanity, I think we are in dire need of alternate internationalist imaginaries. And I am eager to reflect on this task with you all. So for this occasion, I have written about Adolfo Gili, the Mexican-based Argentinian radical who followed the spirit of the Mexican Revolution across most of the 20th century. Inspired by the way that Gili took his inspiration from Walter Benjamin, I have written my comments as a series of theses. My talk today is entitled 7 Theses, Revolution, Memory, and the Free Territory of Lecumberri. So let me begin. 1. The story is told, and then told again, of a ruling party that massacred its political opponents. Once the blood had been washed from the killing place and the memories of violence all seemed to pass, the remains were gathered up into the rotunda. In time, the broken torsos of organizers would be laid on the ground beside the rotting bodies of their executioners, rusty metals still clinging in the damp. A fresh foundation was poured over all the corpses. As it seeped and hardened into the crevices, the past became a crypt, a solid block of undifferentiated time. Upon this flattened surface, a new face of the state was forged. It memorialized the grand spirit of rebellion while effacing all the tender features of the resistance. Under heavy plaques, the memories of rage were smothered, and the cherished names of the dead were pressed deep into the earth. Only then could a legacy of unity be brutally proclaimed. Writing the history of revolution means rooting the experiences of revolt out from their official commemorations. It means bending to pick the little flowers that still sprout from the commingled soil. 2. The past retains a claim to the present. The dead still speak to the living. We strain to hear the sounds, though they grow as insistent as crows. Not even the dead, wrote Walter Benjamin in 1940, will be safe from the enemy if he is victorious. Against the encroaching fascism of his time, he recognized that this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. Though we are many lifetimes away from his famous essay, Theses on the Philosophy of History, we still heed his cautious words, just as we tread softly around the same gaping maw that swallowed him. 3. We inherit the 19th century prophecies. We struggle under their weight. It was foretold that 20th century revolutions would march first over the paved streets of Western industrial nations. There, the most advanced sectors of the working class were meant to assume primacy. While such assemblages gathered force and might, they often trailed rather than led the prophesied struggles. Indeed, the first revolutions of the 20th century were, quote, chiefly propelled by the oppressed and subaltern of the rural world, as Adolfo Gili observed. Rising against colonialism, imperial rule, exploitation, and or the violence of expropriation, their steps stirred dust over unpaved streets across the planet. 4. While they varied in time, speed, and direction, these unforeseen revolutions shared many common features. They arose against dispossession, the commodification of, quote, every human relationship, and the shattering of the previous human world. Indeed, the last century proved again that worlds which become unrecognizable and uninhabitable duly become ungovernable. In his 2001 9 Theses, Gili explains that the social revolutions of the 20th century were not guided by fixed visions of alternative futures. More often, they were driven by the, quote, intolerable conditions of the present. Gili, like Benjamin, did not see revolutions as engines of history. Rather, both interpreted them as the times that humanity aboard a careening train has frantically tried to pull the emergency brake. The insight haunts our current moment. Looking backwards from our 21st century out from all its needless war-strewn rubble, glass, and bone, revolution seemed to index the times when people could simply absorb no more suffering. 5. From Lecumberri prison in the late 1960s, Adolfo Gili reconsidered the history of the Mexican Revolution in a global frame. An Argentinian socialist, Gili had passed through radical labor, peasant, and social struggles throughout the 1950s and 60s. Through his organizing, he discovered a political language to articulate an intuitive sense of injustice. Through study, he gained the power to connect revolutionary struggles across time and space. Aboard a train to Bolivia in the late 1950s, he read The Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James's classic 1938 study, which explained how enslaved African people had won their own freedom through the Haitian Revolution. While working with radical labor and peasant movements in Bolivia, Chile, and Colombia, Gili became inspired by indigenous traditions of anti-colonial resistance, a sentiment that deepened as he read the writings of Peruvian author José María Arguedas. While in Italy, his study of Antonio Gramsci's work helped him make sense of the, quote, South American industrial peasantry with whom he had organized closely. In the ferment of national liberation struggles from Algeria to Vietnam, he devoured Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth and traveled to Cuba shortly after its revolution. In 1966, he traveled to Mexico after supporting guerrilla forces in Guatemala. He was arrested by Mexican officials and charged with subversion and sentenced to 6 years in Lecumberri. Not by choice then, but by chance, Gili was in Mexico when the country and the world were forced to reckon with the legacy of the Mexican Revolution. This reckoning was hastened as Mexico's low-intensity dirty war broke out into more public view. On the eve of Mexico City's 1968 Olympic Games, and after protracted rallies and strikes, thousands of university students gathered at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas. Against growing state repression, they demanded fair elections, press freedom, assembly without aggression from granaderos, and the implementation of the revolutionary 1917 Constitution's tenets. That October day, contingents of trade unionists, parents, teachers, and fervent supporters were joined by curious onlookers from the surrounding Tlatelolco neighborhood. As the rally drew to a close, lights suddenly flared, sirens wailed, and government troops began shooting into the crowd. In the melee, hundreds were viciously murdered and thousands more were maimed. In the aftermath of this now well-known massacre, the ruling Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI, self-described heir to the Mexican Revolution, struggled to spell its name in the blood. After the massacre at Tlatelolco, Lecumberri prison swelled with newly incarcerated protesters. Those students would have been familiar with El Palacio Negro, as it was known. At previous rallies in the Zócalo, they had read the words of prisoners like the journalist Victor Rico Galán, who had implored the crowd in a letter, Oír pueblo, estudiantes. Students had agitated for the release of prisoners sentenced under Article 145 of the Federal Penal Code against, quote, social dissolution, the spreading of ideas which might produce rebellion, sedition, riot, or insurrection. They further sought to abolish Article 145 itself. In late August, thousands had marched to the prison, encircling it with lit torches and shouting up to the cell blocks, "Los vamos a sacar." Less than 2 months later, protesters would be locked behind the very walls where their hopeful chants had only recently echoed. Tlatelolco protesters were incarcerated alongside the renowned political prisoners of Lecumberri. Inside, they discovered that Gili and his fellow captives had repurposed parts of the prison, including its en bloc, for collective education, outreach, and organizing. Prisoners collaborated on intellectual activities, such as offering each other classes, co-editing publications, writing poetry, running workshops, discussing books, and planning collective action. Through different formations, they kept abreast of the world of 1968. Prisoners watched as the PRI tried to manage Tlatelolco's aftermath, ominously declaring, quote, everything is possible in peace throughout the Olympics television broadcast. They noted the protests of Tommy Smith and John Carlos, African-American athletes who raised their fists in Black Power salutes from the podium, defying US racism and apartheid in South Africa and Rhodesia, while the Australian silver medalist Peter Norman stood in solidarity with them and with Australia's Aboriginal people. They watched Vera Jaslovska, the Czech gymnast, turn her head in defiance of the USSR's national anthem, a small act of protest against the recent Soviet invasion of her country. Prisoners followed international opposition to the US slaughter in Vietnam, discussing it with their fellow prisoner, Bernard Philip Ames, a US Marine who had deserted from the war. They read, wrote, debated, and lectured together, circulating article drafts and manuscripts. In this alternative Department of Political Science, as it would come to be known, prisoners educated each other about politics as it unfolded in real time. At one point, they posted a sign declaring, quote, en bloc, free territory of Lecumberri. In this moment of global reckoning, en bloc prisoners debated the Mexican Revolution, and they consciously did so among its many living vestiges. Oil paint fumes may still have emanated from the poorly ventilated Cell 36. Between its narrow walls, the celebrated communist artist and Mexican revolutionary veteran David Alfaro Siqueiros had painted furiously for years, nearly asphyxiating himself before his release in 1964. In court, Siqueiros had loudly condemned his sentence under Article 145 as a complete contradiction to the Mexico of the Revolution, of which he remained a radical icon. Incarcerated rural communist leader Ramon Danzos Palomino was still inspired by the revolution's most radical land reforms. Palomino, who was born amidst the revolution in 1918, published a call to action from Lecumberri, writing to rural workers and opposition, quote, let us honor Zapata's memory by making the 10th of April a date of revolutionary and combative struggle against those who would detract from his ideal. The journalist Galan was a firm proponent of the idea that the revolution had been a popular peasant-led workers' revolution, a notion that seemed to have inspired Gili as well. When Gili's friend and former teacher, Cesar Nicolas Molina Flores, joined the ranks of the prisoners, he encouraged Gili to write a new Marxist interpretation of the Mexican Revolution, one suitable for the then present moment of global radical struggle. Like Gili, Flores was an ardent Trotskyist. His prized possession was a recording of Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary leader and dissident, addressing the US Socialist Workers' Party from his Coyoacan home in exile. And incidentally, Trotsky's assassin, the Spanish communist and Stalinist agent Ramon Mercader, had himself been incarcerated in Lecumberri from 1940 to 1960. With Flores' encouragement, Gili began to consider the wider implications of the Mexican Revolution in wake of the Tlatelolco massacre and in conjunction with other global revolutions. Doing so meant retrieving an incendiary memory from the official history in which it had been entombed. 6. Gili decided to interpret the Mexican Revolution through Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution. In those opening pages, Trotsky had observed that, quote, the masses go into a revolution not with a prepared plan of social reconstruction, but with a sharp feeling that they cannot endure the old regime. His analysis centered on social drama, historical contingency, and class struggle. Gili's proposal to analyze the Mexican Revolution through Trotsky's work put him at odds with the official reigning interpretation. In the accepted Mexican state version, the past was simply a prelude to the present, with the Mexican Revolution logically culminating in the production of the 1917 Constitution and the consolidation of the post-revolutionary state under the PRI. But by 1968, the PRI was struggling to retain a revolutionary popular mantle as it simultaneously mowed down protesters and tortured political dissidents. In Lecumberri, Gili began distinguishing the revolution from its heroic but zombified state representations. He instead identified the dynamism at the core of struggles within the revolution. Rather than seeing them as peaceably resolved within the structure of the PRI, he perceived the struggles for land, freedom, dignity, and workers' powers as ongoing. The revolution in his account had not been resolved by the state. It had merely been, quote, interrupted by it. Give me 1 minute. Gili beheld a subterranean history of the Mexican Revolution that remained a central motivating factor for Mexican campesinos, workers, students, and artists, including global radicals like himself. He recognized that the conditions which had precipitated revolution, mass dispossession, immiseration, despotism, uneven capitalist development, and expropriation were not unique to Mexico, but part of the peculiarities of its national capitalist development and su integración en el moderno mercado mundial capitalista. His goal was to take the history of the Mexican Revolution out of state ideology and put its analysis, quote, in interrelation with the broader world situation. Inspired by Trotsky, Gili further recognized that the potential of the Mexican Revolution to inspire other struggles around the world. Indeed, foreign radicals like him had similarly passed through revolutionary Mexico, finding unexpected political resonance with struggles they had imagined to be unique to their own national contexts. If, as Gili surmised, the Mexican Revolution had been global, and if the impulses that drove it remained alive and ongoing, then the protesters and international dissidents of his time could be seen as simply picking up the threads. And so in the end block of Lecumberri prison, Gili attempted to seize the memory of the Mexican Revolution as it flashed up in a moment of danger. To conclude, 7, we must turn our face to the past. We can behold the present horrifying moment not as an exceptional disaster, but as the culmination of previously unresolved catastrophes. Squinting through the official records, we can trace the courage of people who came before, a stubbornly brilliant light that occasionally flashes up across the storm of centuries. We stand to inherit their visions, those who came together across space and across borders to imagine an alternative future, not because they had perfected their political program, but because they also found the global condition in all its needless terror utterly and unforgivably intolerable. As Adolfo Gili reflected, we might recover the memory and experience of the 20th century's lightning flash revolutions, including the Mexican Revolution, so that we may, quote, illuminate the present moment of danger. With such a backwards-looking recovery, we might perceive in the past the not yet arrived, a remembrance of things to come, an unmapped horizon of hope that is revealed only as it is traversed. Thank you.
What is LASA? LASA is hard to define. We create an event. And I think that part of what makes LASA an event is this momentary meeting of a plural and diverse collection of incredible scholars and practitioners and students. And when we come together at a particular time or place to reflect, to debate, it shapes our identity, it shapes our position vis-a-vis the rest of the world. We often say that it's more than an annual conference, and it is. It encompasses the Latin American Research Review, LASA Press, the LASA Forum, the Latin American Cultural Center, the Regional Symposia. It hosts book fairs, film festivals, and film series. It presents awards and prizes.
There is no other place on the planet, Earth, where you can feel intellectually as comfortable as in the Latin American Studies Association.
Pensar LASA en estos 60 años es pensar en una comunidad que no deja de producir ideas, debates y vínculos que cruzan países y generaciones. En estos últimos 10 años crecimos mucho en escala y en alcance, y mi trabajo y el del secretariado fue ayudar a que esa energía se traduzca en capacidad real, equipos, procesos y estructura, para que las iniciativas de las y los presidentes, el Consejo Ejecutivo, las secciones, y los miembros se convierta en realidad.
LASA always coincides with events in the world that challenge us.
Apenas 2 semanas después de las elecciones presidenciales.
As an association, we form witness to wars, civil and international, to dictatorships, complicated political transitions, polarization, ecological crises, shifts in global power. But LASA has always remained a plural space in which rigorous scholarship and civic engagement go hand in hand. It's a voice for our community, offering advocacy and the defense of research and teaching. A source of our professional identity, an ongoing invitation to deepen our knowledge and awareness of the complexities of the world, of other people, of ourselves. I guess above all, it's a community. Although it's just a moment, it defines us. And I think we come away reoriented, reshaped. Maybe we are actually sort of confirmed in our mature judgments. Maybe we're challenged by some of the things that we've heard. Whatever the case may be, there's a kind of a magic in our coming together in all of our diversity and complexity. LASA gives us endless opportunities to practice dialogue, mutual respect, and collaboration. Together, we can be more creative and more courageous. LASA is a home in the world with many rooms and many windows, and I hope everyone can find a place in. Looking ahead, our challenge is clear: to strengthen LASA as a principled, strong, thoughtful, and plural voice, defending academic freedom and civic engagement, even in times of crisis, of polarization, and democratic backsliding, when finding agreement can be difficult.
Y hacia adelante, el desafío es claro: sostener esa potencia con estabilidad y recursos y seguir siendo un espacio plural, global y vivo.
Como encontrar una familia desperdigada por el mundo. Yo pienso que le toma el pulso a lo que se está cocinando, a lo que está sucediendo. I think it really functions as an intellectual community. That's very important.
De alguna forma entablar diálogo intergeneracional, y de eso también enriquece los estudios y el campo.
It's nice that there's a lot more research related to activism and the internet and technology.
Activistas, conocedores, intelectuales indígenas, en donde pues se puedan poner estos conocimientos en diálogo.
What I've most liked is actually the film festival, the series of.
And if your field is Latin America, you are a Latin Americanist and you are welcome in the Latin American Studies Association.
Siempre aprendo algo nuevo en los congresos, pero también en el proceso.
Colaboraciones y solidaridades denso.
A commitment to social transformation, social justice, intellectual expression, and academic freedom, and that we will always be monitoring and being vigilant on those fronts, because if not, there would be no loss.
Hoy más que nunca deben de conducirse a la construcción de otros mundos posibles.
LASA must continue to be a strong, thoughtful, principled, and plural voice, defending academic freedom, promoting diversity, and linking research to action.